Well, tonight, this is our last lesson in our walk through the Bible. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too. And we are reinforcing what we already know, and we're maybe learning some new things as well. And so we're going to do review tonight, and we're going to look at the silent years, the 400 silent years between the end of the Old Testament, beginning of the New. But most of it will be by way of review tonight. So we're going to start with this, as usual. Okay, so here we go. You ready? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Very, very good. And we've done that often enough. Probably all of us have memorized that by now if you didn't already know. Now, tonight we're going to be looking at the silent years, some of the things that happened between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, where really God was paving the way for Christ and really for the gospel to go forth. We'll see some of those details and some information about that period of time. But we are going to zero in on the whole period of time, which we began. Of course, we began in Genesis. Of course, Genesis chapter 12, the very first Hebrew is Abraham. The word Hebrew means he who is from afar. So Abraham went out not knowing whether he went, and came into the land of Canaan. The patriarchs, Abraham and his son Isaac, his son Jacob, his son Joseph. That's basically the story of the book of Genesis from chapter 12 to chapter 50. Then we come in, and this is drawn to scale. Then we have the Egyptian bondage. We round it off to 400 years. It's actually 430 years. And then the Exodus under Moses, 40 years. And then Joshua, the conquest, 15 years. And then another rounded up figure, about 400 years of the time of the judges. So Joshua into Judges. The last judge was a man by the name of Samuel, and he anointed the first king, who was Saul, during the time of the United Kingdom, 120 years. So there were three kings. How long did they each reign for? 40 times 3 is 120. And then Solomon messed up big time. And so his son Rehoboam really was the judgment of God upon Israel. And so the kingdom was rent in twain. So we have the divided kingdom for another period rounded up of about 400 years. And you had Rehoboam, who's the son of Solomon, and Jeroboam, who was really a leader under Solomon. And now the 10 northern tribes split off the 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And that lasts until the Assyrians come and take the northern 10 tribes into captivity. And are really scattered, but always remember that there was a godly remnant of both the Levites and representatives of all of the 10 tribes that came south and worshiped God in the temple and aligned themselves with the kingdom of Judah. So there really is no lost tribes. Israel today is Israel of the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, it's not just Judah. And of course, Judah, the reason we call them Jews is because that period of time, Jews is a shortened form of Judah. Then we had the Babylonian captivity for 70 years of exile. And of course, the 2 prophets at that point were Daniel and Ezekiel. And you remember the Ezekiel prophecies, and Daniel as well, are not just going to deal with the near future about what's going to happen to them after the 70 years, but their prophecies go way into the future. And we looked at many of those from Daniel, but also Ezekiel. So Ezekiel 37, the valley of bones, dry bones. Can these bones live? God asked Ezekiel, and he says, thou knowest. And the bones are representing Israel that has been dead and scattered. And now God is going to bring them bone upon bone, and then the sinews, and then the flesh and the skin. And then finally life will be breathed into this entity, which is really a revived, a reconstituted nation of Israel. And then the things that take place, you get the battle of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38, 39, then the millennial temple in chapter 43, the end of the book. So those 2 prophets in the exile are Daniel and Ezekiel. Then we come to the time of the restoration. Now there's 4 characters, even though we have 3 up here. This is the time of the return. And so after the Babylonian captivity, they come back into the land. The first character is Zerubbabel, and he builds the temple. And before he builds the temple, he builds an altar. And they sacrifice, after all those years, on the first day of the 7th month, which is the Feast of Trumpets. And really the fulfillment of the Feast of Trumpets is revival in the sacrificial system, which is really still future. The next person is Ezra. And Ezra is the scribe, and he teaches the people. He reaches the people. And then there's another one that's not there, between Ezra and Nehemiah, and her name is Esther. In fact, I think Esther actually comes between Ezra and Zerubbabel. Okay. Let me just go forward here a little bit here. See, there we go. So there's Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, builds the temple. Then we have Esther, queen, who still is in Persia. Of course, the whole book of Esther is about that. Then we have Ezra the scribe, who comes to restore the people's knowledge of the law, bring revival. That also happens later on in the book of Nehemiah on the first day of the 7th month. Again, the Feast of Trumpets. Then after Ezra, Nehemiah, we all know about Nehemiah, comes back and he builds the walls of Jerusalem. Now Nehemiah is important because Daniel prophesies that the calendar of events that we know as Daniel's 70 weeks begins in 445 BC when Artaxerxes gives the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. So that happens during the time of Nehemiah. It happens in the month of Nisan. So it's right to the very day, the month and the year that Daniel prophesies when the Messiah would come. Okay, let's go back up here a little bit. Then after Nehemiah, so basically at the end of Nehemiah, that you're at the end of the Old Testament story. The people are back in the land, and now there's silence for 400 years. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. And then the next thing that happens is John the Baptist comes on the scene. And at least his birth is announced and so on, and then the story with Mary and Joseph and the birth of Jesus. So 400 years until Christ. Okay, so here we go. This will stand. If you're visiting, you're excused. And you can kind of just look at the rest of us. I've been practicing, but I'm not sure if it's going to work. But I have been practicing. Okay, you ready? So we're going through the Old Testament, the main characters, the main events, main places, and 77 memory points with action. So here we go. Creation, fall, flood, nations, 400 years, Persian Gulf, Salt, Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah, Tigris, Euphrates, Haran, Dies, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Mediterranean, Israel, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, Jews, Egypt, 400 years bondage, Moses, let my people go. No, 10 plagues, Passover, Red Sea, Mount Sinai, law, tabernacle, Levites and priests, offerings and feasts, counting the faces, Kadesh oasis, 12 spies, wanderers, dies, Moses, Moab, second law, dies. Joshua, Jordan, Jericho, divide, conquer, south, north, divide, settle, 12 tribes. Judges, 400 years. Samson, Deborah, you messed me up there. Deborah, Gideon, Samson. Every man did that which is right in his own eyes except Ruth and Samuel. United Kingdom, 120 years. Saul, no heart. David, whole heart, Solomon half heart. Divided kingdom, 400 years, north, south, Israel, Judah, 1920, 08. Prophets speak, shape up or ship out. Assyria, Israel scatter, Babylonia, Judah exile, 70 years. So Persia, Judah return, Zerubbabel, temple, Esther, queen, Ezra, people, Nehemiah, walls, 400 years, silence, Christ. My microphone got off when I bent down there. Please be seated, thank you. Oh, we got a new microphone and I'm having trouble. Hey, that was really very, very good, except for Michael messing me up there, but... that was fun. And we'll do it one more time before we go. Okay, so again, recap on and this is part of the Old Testament story that really, we don't really emphasize a lot, is the return and the restoration, but it's really important. And so those four main characters are Zerubbabel, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Zerubbabel, temple, Esther, queen, Ezra, people, Nehemiah, walls. Ezra is the scribe, opening the scripture, building up the people. Now, when Zerubbabel started to build the temple, they only got into it about 2 years, and they got all kinds of opposition from really the Samaritans, because they were still in the land. And the people got discouraged, and they wanted to build their own houses, so they built their own houses, and God's temple lay waste. And so there were two prophets that came along to really deal with that. One was Haggai, and the other was Zechariah. And again, some of the prophets here, even like Zechariah, has a lot to do with Jesus, has a lot to do with the future, because they were kind of discouraged. Some of the old people remembered Solomon's temple, and they were crying because this new temple was just a shadow of Solomon's. And then there were the young people had never seen Solomon's temple. They're jumping up and down with joy, and they're excited about it. And so Zechariah comes along and says, you know, you think this temple is as nothing. And Zechariah says, despise not the day of small things, because he says the glory of this latter temple will be greater than that of Solomon's. And of course, he's pointing forward in time to when Jesus comes. When Jesus comes, he will build the temple in Jerusalem. Read Ezekiel chapter 40 for the next 8 chapters, chapter 43, chapter 48, 49. It describes the millennial temple. That has never been built. And some people say, well, it never will be built. Well, then why did God write those chapters in Ezekiel? It just doesn't make sense. Jesus will come, and he will restore all things. Okay, so then Malachi is dealing with the people whose hearts became hard. So they're back in the land, and it's just like the time of Judges, you know. God brought them through all those things, but then they just got backslidden and hard. So Malachi comes along really to revive the heart of the people. Of course, Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament. So what we've been looking at, and of course you're very familiar with this. This is my little chart that we've used for years. You know, up here we start with Genesis 1 and we end with Revelation 22. You see here the Gospels. So Genesis to Malachi is this spot right here, in between those arrows. This yellow line represents 0, okay? In the sense that, this is the beginning of Christ and the New Testament. The New Testament really doesn't begin until we have the death of the testator. So Jesus was made under the law. That's why the blue continues on after the yellow line up until the cross, and really until the sacrifice, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, his ascension, and then the coming of the Holy Spirit, which I believe is the beginning of this unknown period of time called the church. How long does the church last for? We don't know. Because the rapture could happen at any moment, and that will end that period of time. But just to point out a few things, you're basically dealing with 3 entities here. The Gentiles, because before Abraham there were no Jews. Noah was not a Jew. He was a saved man. He was a child of God, but he wasn't a Jew. The first Jew was Abraham, okay? So from Genesis 12 with Abraham all through the rest of this period of time, it's dealing with the nation of Israel. It's Israel, okay? And in Daniel, Daniel prophesied about the 70 weeks, you see, 490 years determined upon Israel in Daniel chapter 9. Now, he prophesied a year, that was 100 years before the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem actually happened. So it's amazing that these prophecies were hundreds of years before they were fulfilled. And of course, it started in 445 BC, and then in 32 AD, which was actually 483 years, 69 of the weeks, when that was fulfilled, he says, until Messiah the Prince. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, which means he's going to die, but not for himself. That's an amazing thing. Daniel prophesied when the Messiah would come. You know, the Old Testament tells you how he would come of a virgin. It tells you where he would come, Micah 5:2, Bethlehem. It tells you of what family he would come in the book of Jeremiah, the family of David. In Genesis 49, it tells you of what tribe he would come. A lawgiver shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. And here it actually tells you when he would come, to the very day. And we believe that in the month of Nisan, which is our March-April time, when Jesus came into Jerusalem riding upon the donkey, that was the presentation, the exact date. It was 483 years exactly from the time of the commandment until that happened. And then once he presented himself, he was rejected. And after 62 weeks, it was actually 5 days after that, he was crucified. And there's a gap in there between the 69th week and the 70th week. Because everything that was promised in Daniel chapter 9 concerning Israel and Jerusalem, that hasn't been fulfilled yet. I mean, it's everlasting righteousness, to end the transgression, to anoint the most holy. All those things have not happened yet. So how do we explain that? Well, what we believe is that God stopped the calendar and he inserted this period of time that we're now living in. So there is 1 week of years, 7 years in length, that's still out there in the future. We call that, commonly we call that the tribulation. It's, you know, we know what we're saying when we say the tribulation, okay? But it's actually the 70th week of Daniel. It's also known as the day of the Lord. So that's still future. So that's why here we have this ripped apart, and you have the last week over here, okay? And where is it going to be? What's in here? We don't know how much time. The church is there. The church will end when the rapture happens. By the way, there was a little gap between the death of Christ and the ending of the 69th week. There was a little gap between the rejection of Israel, which happened really in Matthew chapter 23. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets, stonest them in their sandals. How oft would I have gathered, but you, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Well, there was many days that happened after that before the church started. So there was a time gap between the end of the 69th week until the beginning of the church. So there's a little gap in there. So there is a possibility that there's a little gap between the rapture of the church, when the church is taken out, before the 70th week begins. So it's not like the rapture happens like now and the Antichrist is revealed tonight. It doesn't have to happen that way. There could be a little gap in there at the end of the church age because there was a gap at the beginning of the church age. You with me? Okay, so anyway, that's basically the overall scheme from Genesis to Revelation. And what we've been looking at, of course, is just Genesis to Malachi, but the rest of the story. Wouldn't it be terrible if the story ended in Malachi? Read Malachi chapter 4. It ends with the word curse, right? And it also ends with a promise that he would send Elijah to restore, and that's still future, the future ministry of Elijah. Okay, so we looked at this, and we're not going to look at this again tonight, but the promise of what we've been speaking about is in Daniel chapter 9, those 70 weeks. And then the fulfillment, initial fulfillment, is in Nehemiah chapter 1 and chapter 2. And you can look that up. That's where the commandment went forth to restore and build Jerusalem. It was given by Artaxerxes to Nehemiah. In the second year of his reign, which was actually, we know this, you can look this up, 445 BC, in the month of Nisan. And so we know exactly when Jesus would come. And isn't it wonderful that that when Jesus came, that there were wise men who came from the east. They've been looking for they saw his sign, the star in the sky. We have come to worship him. Now, they knew the timing, but they didn't know the place. They didn't have Micah 5 verse 2. And so they went to Jerusalem. Now, wise men as magi. And so when you read the book of Daniel, Daniel was a magi. Daniel was a wise man. So it's interesting that maybe that those men who came, we don't know there was 3 kings. Who knows? They had 3 different kinds of gifts, but there could have been 40 of them. Who knows? But these kings came from the east. These wise men came from the east. And well, how did they know there would be a king of Israel? How did they know that there would be a sign? How did they know that this was something that was worthy of their attention? Because they had the book of Daniel. And they had the time frame. That's why they were looking, because they had the time frame. So Daniel and Ezekiel, as we mentioned, are in here. This line represents the storyline, and the gap represents the Babylonian captivity. Daniel, Ezekiel. Now, the reason I'm going over this is because we're going to be a test here in a second. Okay. Now, you remember what we did here. We said basically that the prophets, we laid them out here in such a way where you can identify them geographically. So there's only 2 prophets to Israel, and that was Hosea up here and Amos. We have Jonah and Nahum because they are ministering to Nineveh. Okay, so I've got to turn around. So Israel's up here, Judah's down here, and Nineveh and Assyria's over here, and Edom is down here. Okay, so up here you have Israel, prophets to Israel, Hosea and Amos. Down here in red you have all the prophets to Judah. Habakkuk, Isaiah, of course, is a big one. Jeremiah is a big one. Joel, Micah, Zephaniah, and even Lamentations. Lamentations is Jeremiah witnessing the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, notice in the corner, in purple, is Obadiah. Obadiah is a different kind of book because it's a prophecy about Edom. Edom is Esau. Esau is the brother of Jacob. And Esau did not treat Jacob right. That's how it describes it. So the Edomites persecuted Israel. When Israel, in fact, Judah was being judged, they were laughing at them. And God says, I'm watching. And now you shouldn't have done that. And so I'm going to judge you because of how you mistreated my people. So that's the book of Obadiah, and my brother's keeper, Edom. Okay. Then after the captivity, you have Zechariah, Haggai, okay, who minister about getting the temple rebuilt. Haggai. Zechariah speaks about the Messiah, wonderful prophecies. Zechariah chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14. Amazing prophecies about Jesus, and there's other stuff in there as well in the first part of the book. And then we have Ezra in the return. We've got Esther. Why is Esther over here on the right-hand side? Because that's where Persia is, okay? And then the last 2, of course, Malachi is a prophet, the last of the Old Testament prophets, and then Nehemiah is the last of the history books describing the building of the walls, okay? All right, and we've looked at that. Okay, let's go on to this. Now, we're going to be flipping back and forth because the test is on the next slide. But it's going to be a talk-through test, okay? In fact, the answers are going to be on the board. And it's the same test that you had at the beginning. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that to see if you actually made any progress. Did we just waste the last 15 weeks? I don't think we did. Now, what I did here was I put the different points, memory pegs that we've been learning in associated with the books. Okay, so point 1 to point 23 is all in the book of Genesis. Okay, so everything in blue here, all these points have to do with Exodus. Leviticus only gets 2 points. Levites and priests, offerings and feasts. Okay, counting the faces is in Numbers. That's what it's called, Numbers, because they counted the people. And so then Deuteronomy. What does Deuteronomy mean? Second law. Deuteros, nomos. Deuteros means second. Nomos means law. And as we've said many times, the first time it was given was Exodus at the beginning of the 40 years. And the second time it was given is at Moab, just before Moses dies, at the end of the 40 years. So it's the second time it's given. So you get the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. You also get the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Then we have Joshua up here. All these things happen in the book of Joshua. Then we have the book of Judges. Then we have 1 Samuel, which basically starts with Samuel and how he anoints Saul to be the first king. Begins the United Kingdom, 120 years. Then you have 2 Samuel, which deals with David. And then you have 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, which deals with Solomon. 2 Kings deals with the rest of the kings of Israel and Judah. And how many kings did Israel have? 19, 20. Good kings? Israel, 0. No good kings in Israel. And we had 8 good kings in Judah. That's what that's about. Okay. Then we get into the divided kingdom here, like I said. And then you're into the Babylonian captivity. And of course, during that period of time, you have, just after that, you have Esther in Persia, and then Ezra, the return in the book of Ezra. Nehemiah is part of that period of time, but we've got Nehemiah over here by himself, Nehemiah and the walls, and then 400 silent years, and then Christ. Okay, so here's the test. So let's walk through this as quickly as we can. Who came first? Now, it's really easy because the answer is in red. Have you ever had a test like this before? Wouldn't you love for all your tests to be like this? But the reason I'm doing this is because that's the only slide I had. No, the reason we're doing this is because I want you to see the answer, and I want us to figure out why the answer is what it is. Okay, so who's Saul? He's the first king. Who's Samson? He's a judge. Who came first? The judges came before the kings, right? Daniel or Jonah? Well, Daniel ministered during the Babylonian captivity. Jonah ministers to Nineveh before, and that Nineveh is the Assyrians. Before Assyria, Israel scatter, Jonah went there. I forget what it is. It's over 100 years before the Assyrians came and captured. One of the reasons Jonah didn't want to go was not because they were so wicked, and they were very wicked, but he also knew that they were the enemy of God's people. And Jonah's fear came true. Okay, so who would have come first then? Obviously, Jonah came first because he's Nineveh, pre-Assyria, and Daniel is the next kingdom, which is the Babylonians, the Babylonian captivity. Esther or Nehemiah? That's a little bit more difficult, isn't it? Who comes first? Well, Esther comes first, and then Nehemiah comes later, building the walls. There's 91 years between Zerubbabel and Nehemiah during the time of the restoration. So there's a period of time in there. Okay, who came first, Moses or Jacob? Well, Jacob's one of the patriarchs, and Moses is after the 400 years in bondage in Egypt. So there's a long period of time between Moses and Jacob, and of course Jacob comes first. Zerubbabel or David? Well, Zerubbabel builds the wall, and David's the second king, so obviously David comes first. Now this might be more of a difficult one. What came first, tabernacle or 10 commandments? And of course you know because it's on the board, but okay, if we go back up here, the law comes first. Really the first contact at Sinai that God has with the people is, and you get this in Exodus 20, God actually gives them the commandments in their ears. It wasn't that just Moses wrote the commandments down. God, before Moses went up there, God gave them the 10 commandments in their ears, and they were basically saying, they said to Moses, Lord, Moses, you deal with the Lord because we can't take this. So the 10 commandments came first, and then when Moses went up on the mount and he gets them written down and he smashes them, goes back up the second time. But when he comes back down with the law, he also has not just the 10 commandments, but all the laws that are given in the book of Exodus and Leviticus. There's 613 laws altogether. But also in Exodus, he has the blueprint for the tabernacle. And it's all laid out, and then Exodus goes through, really the rest of Exodus is about how the people make the tabernacle. But what comes first? The law comes first, then the tabernacle comes after that. Sorry. Okay, manna or Passover? Well, the Passover is the beginning of the Exodus, right? So they go out. What kind of bread did they have when they went out? Unleavened bread, right? It's the feast of Passover, then the feast of unleavened bread. Jesus ate the Last Supper, was the Passover. What kind of bread did they have on the table? There was no such thing as fluffy bread because they got rid of all the leaven. So why do we use crackers? Why do churches use fluffy loaf bread? Why do they do that? Because they don't understand the Bible. Because the Last Supper was the Passover, it was unleavened bread. Okay, so Passover comes first. And by the way, the reason it was unleavened is because unleavened bread will last for weeks. Fluffy bread will last for days. And they were going out on a journey. So they go out in the Exodus. They run out of bread. They run out of water. And God provides the water at the bitter waters of Marah, cuts the tree down. The waters are healed. And then they go a little further, and God tells them that they're going to get manna. And how many days did they get manna? 6 days. On the 7th, no manna. And if they kept the manna on the first day, what happened to it the next day? It was stinking. It had corrupted. So the manna was fresh every day, but on the Friday, they gathered twice as much to carry them over the Sabbath until the first day of the week. Okay, how long was the bondage in bondage? 400 years. And by the way, God told Abraham that in Genesis chapter 15. He told him that's how long it would be, 430 years. For the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. So Joshua, the people of Israel, refrained from going into the promised land because the people in the promised land hadn't fulfilled all of their wickedness. But when they did, then judgment came. The exile in Babylon, 70 years. United Kingdom, 120 years. Who was Abraham's son of promise? Isaac. What does Isaac mean? Ha ha ha, laughter. What does Ishmael mean? Ishmael means asked, or that means heard actually. His mother Hagar asked, and God heard. His name was Ishmael. Esau's brother, Jacob. Esau is also Edom. Abraham's wife, Sarah. Second king of Israel. Who was the third king? Solomon. Saul, no heart. David, whole heart. Solomon, half heart. Who's Moses' brother? Aaron. Who's his mother? Who's his sister? Miriam. Who's his mommy and daddy? She got it right. I was looking for Barbara because that's her favorite question. Jochebed and Amram. Okay. All right. In what book would you find the tabernacle built? Up here. Tabernacle, Exodus. Okay. Saul crowned king. See, these are the more difficult ones, right? So you'd have to go kind of back up. Saul was crowned king here in 1 Samuel, because that talks about Samuel. David and Bathsheba, it's David's life, 2 Samuel. 12 spies, Book of Numbers. 10 plagues, Exodus. Joseph, Genesis. Gideon, Judges. Jerusalem destroyed. So the end of the story is really in 2 Kings. And remember, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles go over the same history as 1 and 2 Kings, I think 2 Samuel as well. And so the end of the story is in the last chapters of 2 Kings and also the last chapter of 2 Chronicles. That's when Nebuchadnezzar is coming in and judging the kings of Judah and taking away people captive. There was 3 different captivities. The last one was when he burned the temple and just cleared the place out. So that's the last of the history there before the Babylonian captivity. After the Babylonian captivity, the history books are Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay. Prophecy against Edom. That was a hard one, right? Obadiah. Okay, that's the one over here, right? Obadiah. And then the Valley of Dry Bones is Ezekiel. Okay. Let's go through this very quickly. What about the time between the Old and New Testaments? And of course, before the Persians, the Media Persians, before that was the Babylonians, before that was the Assyrians, so Assyria, Babylon, Media Persia, then Greece, and then the Roman Empire after that. So things that happened that were important in between the Old and New Testaments. First thing is the Old Testament canon was completed. Malachi was finished for 400 years. The Old Testament was finished at least 400 years before Jesus came. That's why it's amazing that the apostles preached Jesus out of the Scriptures. The only Scriptures they had was the Old Testament. How do you get Jesus in the Old Testament, which was finished 400 years before he was born? The Bible is a supernatural book. That's why we believe it. The evidence is there. So we have new religious groups that pop up in this period of time, usually about 150 BC. Now, there's lots of history in there. There's the Maccabean Revolt and Antiochus Epiphanes and all of that. And you get that in the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which is part of the Apocrypha, which is not inspired, but it's pretty good history, reading history. So in this period of time, 150 BC, you have the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. We've just got three of them up here. So let's go and look at those real quick. I don't want to bore you with all of this, but the Pharisees, the name Pharisee means separated ones. And they believed in a radical personal holiness. They believed in internalizing their religious law. How did that work out? Not very well. Because Jesus said you're like whited sepulchres. They wanted to look out on the outside, but it really wasn't internalized. You know why? Because they weren't saved, they weren't regenerated. And they also believed that God would give punishment and reward in the afterlife. Now, why is that important? Well, because they believed in heaven and hell, angels, and the resurrection. Now, one of the distinctions, we'll contrast that with the Sadducees in here in just a moment, but they taught the authority of oral law and was often promoted over the written word. Mark 7, Jesus deals with that. You know, they said, well, if you're going to give a gift, you're going to give money to your parents to look after them, but you take that money and you give it to the temple or you give it to us, then you're relieved of your responsibilities to your parents. And Jesus came along and said, that's wicked. Because by your traditions, you're violating the commands of God. And many other such things you do, he said. So he dealt with that in Mark 7. But famous Pharisees, Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee. When it says he was a ruler of the Jews, he was also a member of the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling body in Israel, 70. Goes back to Moses with the 70 elders. It's the same idea. Nicodemus was a Pharisee. Saul of Tarsus, who later became Paul, was a Pharisee. Gamaliel, who taught Saul, was a Pharisee. The scribes are very much connected with the Pharisees. They believe similarly to the Pharisees were often grouped together by Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees. They copied, their job was to copy the written scriptures, and they were therefore familiar with the Old Testament. They're also called lawyers because of their knowledge of the law given in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Ezra was a scribe, and the priest, according to Nehemiah chapter 8. So, have you ever seen some of these black preachers? I've seen some of these on YouTube. There's one guy, I don't know his name, I don't really follow it very much, but they got this guy over here, right beside the pulpit. He's got a little table. Have you ever seen this? And he's sitting there and he's got the Bible open. And your man's preaching over there, and he's basically in the back checking him out. And maybe the preacher's looking for a verse, and he'll come up with the verse and say it to the preacher, and then he'll preach it, you know. But your man's back here fact-checking him on the Bible. He's like the scribe and the lawyer, you know. It's really, really cool if you ever watch it. I don't know where they got that from, but it's kind of interesting. But they had a similar type of setup with the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, to contrast, the two major groups are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees, again, were established about the same time, 150 BC. Their name means righteous, and it goes back to the priest of Solomon called Zadok. And this is like the priestly, this is like, these people, the Sadducees made up, they had to do with the temple. They got to choose the high priest, and many of these were priests. All of the Sadducees were priests, but not all the priests were Sadducees. They believed in the establishment, whether that was Rome or Greece or whatever. They would just fall in line with that. They believed that God would kind of rule through whoever was in power at the time. So they made peace with Rome, and they focused on religious ritual, especially concerning the temple. They appointed the high priest and made up the majority of the ruling class of the Sanhedrin. So the 70, the rulers, right? Now Nicodemus was a ruler, but he was a Pharisee, we believe. And Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. But he also was, we believe, a Pharisee. It's kind of like the Pharisees on the Sanhedrin who believed and sided with Jesus, but we don't know of any Sadducees that did, because the Sadducees were really like the liberals of their time. They didn't believe, all they believed in was the written law of the Pentateuch and nothing. So they didn't believe in angels. They didn't even believe in an afterlife. They didn't believe in heaven or hell or anything like that. And that's why, like, I think it's Matthew chapter 20, where they come to, the Pharisees come, a question about the law. The Sadducees come with if a man's been married, if a woman's been married 7 times, whose wife is going to be in the resurrection? They're trying to prove there is no resurrection. And Jesus said, you do err not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God, because in the resurrection they don't marry or they're not given in marriage. So anyway, they didn't believe in the resurrection. They denied the afterlife, angels, and the resurrection. Okay, just really quickly here. The Zealots believed in the overthrow. These were like the political class. These were the guerrillas for the Jewish nation. They believed in the overthrow of the Roman Empire. They would not tolerate pagan idols and practices in their land. God would bring about the kingdom with their help. They refused to pay taxes to Rome. And Jesus had a disciple called Simon Zelotes. Zelotes was not a surname. That was his nickname because Simon was a zealot. Now think about this, because there's another guy on the team called Levi or Matthew, and he's a tax collector. So we got Simon the Zelotes, right? And he's like the guerrilla warfare. He's ready to cut everybody's head off. And if you give, and sometimes they actually did assassinate Jewish people who collaborated with the Romans. That's how intense these guys were. And so he gets saved, and he's part of Jesus' team. And Levi gets saved, and he's a tax collector. Can you imagine the relationship that these two guys had together? Complete opposites of the spectrum. And here they are, disciples of the Lord. The Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament. They believed in withdrawing from a corrupt temple system and the empire. They would live holy lives in an alternative world until God brought about the kingdom without their help. They resided in austere conditions by the Dead Sea. Okay, so there's lots of studies on this. The Dead Sea Scrolls are found in the caves of Qumran, which was it's northwest of the Dead Sea right there. And so these are like very ascetics. They didn't marry, so they died out because there was nobody, they just died out. They didn't marry. They fasted a lot. They didn't have any possessions. They had community. They shared things together. Some people think that John the Baptist, I don't think he was, but some people think that John the Baptist was an Essene. But he had the same kind of austere lifestyle as the Essenes. But they believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls are associated with the Essenes. And of course, Dead Sea Scrolls is not only made up of scriptures, but there's also other books that are not inspired. And actually, some of those books contradict each other. So it's not really the writings of the Essenes. It's possibly a library that they had where they had a whole collection of different kinds of books. And part of those would have been the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we know, as like the book of Isaiah and other portions of scripture that were found in 1948. Okay. So scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, these are the groups now that have been developed in this period of time that Jesus has to deal with in the New Testament. Other things that are really important, the Greek translation of the scriptures happened in the 3rd century BC, about 250 or something. It's called the Septuagint. Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, why is that important? Because everybody in the New Testament knew Greek. And so the Old Testament, it wasn't just the Hebrews that had it. Everybody had it. It was everywhere. Throughout the whole Roman world, the Hebrew scriptures in a language that the people could understand, that language being Greek, was prolific. That's really important because God is about to blow the whole thing open. Where it's not just Israel in the land that he's dealing with and people come to Israel now. Everything is going out the way. And the church is going to be born and the gospel is going to go into all the world. And so there was a quest for knowledge during this period of time. Again, the Grecian culture kind of brought that out in this period of time. The universal Greek language, like I said, this was a language you may have spoken Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever, but you also, or Latin, but you also knew Greek. And so if you're going to communicate the gospel with people, there has to be a common language. That's what happened. God was preparing the way. Isn't that an amazing thing? Because the Bible says in Galatians 4:4, but when the fullness of time was come, when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. Okay? Other things, religious dissatisfaction. Malachi was, reflecting that, but 400 years later, there were still issues. People were not dissatisfied. John the Baptist comes along, preaches repentance, and there is revival. The reason they needed revival is because they didn't have anything like that beforehand, and God was starting a new work. And Jesus, baptized by John the Baptist, was identifying with that new work. Then also persecution and dispersion. We call that the diaspora. What does that mean? It means that the Jews went everywhere. Jews were persecuted. So they went everywhere. And they're still everywhere till today. Only half the Jewish population is in Israel. Just a little less than half, isn't it? That's going to change. And so Jews are everywhere throughout the whole world. The diaspora. James 1 verse 1. James, a servant of Jesus Christ, unto the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greeting. Okay? Now, why is that important? Because when Paul or Peter or Barnabas or Apollos went to preach the gospel, where did they go? Well, they would go to Corinth or they would go to Ephesus. Where did they go to when they went to Thessalonica, when they went to Berea? The synagogue. So God has little pockets of people who already understand the Old Testament. And of course, many of the Jews did believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. But they had a platform already in all these different places. So they go preach the gospel. The Jews get saved, and usually they get persecuted. They start a church, and then they start reaching the Gentiles in that area. It's an amazing thing. All those things were set up by God in preparation for the New Testament, for the gospel. Another thing that helps is, the last thing here, Roman roads. The best roads ever made. Somebody said, here's a Roman road that was built 2,000 years ago and you can still drive on it. Here's a road that was built in Cincinnati 6 months ago and it's full of potholes. But Romans road, all roads lead to Rome, right? And Romans, they built their roads like an arrow. The quickest point from A to B. They would make aqueducts and all kinds of stuff and bridges and so on. But what was that? What did that do? Well, the apostles, they traveled by boat a lot of the times, but once they hit land, they were able to get on these roads and take the gospel. God had a whole network to transport the gospel to all the world. All that was in place, and it was all set up and prepared by God in the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testaments. I think that's amazing. Do you want to do it one more time? This is the last one. Okay, let's do it one more time and then we're finished. Okay, let's all stand, please. Thank you for your patience. Okay, exercise time. Okay, ready? Creation, fall, flood, nations, 400 years, Persian Gulf, Salt, Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah, Tigris, Euphrates, Haran, Tyrannus, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Mediterranean, Israel, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, Jews, Egypt, 400 years, bondage, Moses, let my people go. No, 10 plagues, Passover, Red Sea, Mount Sinai, law, tabernacle, Levites and priests, offerings and feasts, counting the faces, Kadesh oasis, 12 spies, wanderers, dies, Moses, Moab, second law, dies. Joshua, Jordan, Jericho, divide, conquer, south, north, divide, settle, 12 tribes. Judges, 400 years. Deborah, Gideon, Samson. Every man did that which is right in his own eyes except Ruth and Samuel. United Kingdom, 120 years. Saul, no heart. David, whole heart. Solomon, half heart. Divided kingdom, 400 years. North, south, Israel, Judah, 1920, 0A. Prophets speak, shape up or ship out. Assyria, Israel, scatter. Babylonia, Judah exile, 70 years. Persia, Judah return, Zerubbabel, temple, Esther, queen, Ezra, people, Nehemiah, walls, 400 silent years, Christ. Amen.